This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
10:07 at WPSL, the talk of the Treasure Coast. One of the reasons it's time for Ask a Rabbi with Rabbi Shafir Loeb.
And this is Rabbi Shafir Loeb of Congregation Eitz Chaim, your Jewish home on the Treasure Coast. And a beautiful Friday morning, the Friday right before Chanukah. Chanukah starts Sunday night. And sometimes I get asked a question, why do Jewish holidays start at night? Because they always start in the evening. And such as Shabbat, which starts tonight and will run through tomorrow at sunset. And that's because Scripture says it was evening, it was morning, day one. It was evening, it was morning, day two. So from Scriptures, we get the idea that the day starts at sunset. And that makes a ton of sense before clocks. Scriptures were written before clocks, before hours. Hours are a much more recent invention. And we can thank other folks in the general area for those things, like folks who like to divide circles into 360 degrees.
Somebody invented all the workings for the clocks of yesteryear.
And that is true. That is actually the Arabs. They brought it with them to Spain and to Europe, and the Swiss took it from there.
Amazing.
Yep. They did that because they pray in the dark. Two of their services are before or after dark. So they pray 5 times a day. And if you need to know when that time is, you need a way to tell time when there isn't a great big yellow blob in the sky, otherwise known as the sun. And so, yeah.
It's amazing how the sundials helped out a lot back in the early days.
Well, and they were a different kind of a setting. Hours were much more flexible back then because the day was divided into 12 hours and the night was divided into 12 hours. So in the summer, those hours of daylight were longer and the night hours shorter in the northern hemisphere. And the opposite was true in the winter. The daylight hours were short. They were still 12 hours, but they were shorter.
No daylight savings time yet.
They didn't need that because they operated on... They were before electricity, and it's really hard for people like me who are night owls to understand why it was that the folks who get up early in the morning ruled, but it's because of no electricity. When you don't have electricity, you need the sun to give you the daylight so you can work. And so you would get up early before the sun was coming up as it was dawning and get to work in those days so that you would have all of those daylight hours to work, and then you went home from work at the end of the daylight hours when you could no longer work. It was a simple system. And why did the Arabs stay up at night? Now that's another interesting question, because they had coffee.
Oh, Arabica beans.
Arabica beans, yes.
Uh-huh.
And coffee is the beginning of things like midnight services, some of the Jewish service traditions like what are called tikkun leils, where you study all night. You can't do that until you're up all night.
You've talked about the trade routes. How did the Arabica beans wind up in South America?
There were still ships. There have always been ships.
Okay, the regular trade routes on the land and the ships by sea.
Yeah, we say Silk Road, but it was not silk, and it was not a road.
Not always a road.
It was a set of trade routes, many of which were over water. A Chinese explorer named Zheng Ho went up and down Africa and actually brought giraffes. Big animals, giraffes, with him. I just want to imagine what it was like when he was coming into port back in China with a couple of giraffes on the ship.
They wonder, how did they throw the lasso that high?
I'm sure that folks who grew up with giraffes knew exactly how to.
They probably had them trained, hand-fed and everything.
Well, who knows, But in
fairly
any event, it
friendly
was
neighbors.
a gift of trade. Zhang Ho set up on his many journeys. He went out and he was representing the emperor of China, and he established trade treaties with a variety of countries. But he went up and down the waterways in and around China. So we can owe a lot of things to him. Why is it called the Silk Road? Because of the silk traders that wanted to sell their goods. China had kept secret how to make silk. It's a somewhat of an interesting process. Okay. And I see that we do have a caller. We have a caller, Mark. Thank you for calling in, Mark, on this beautiful Friday.
How are you, Rabbi?
I'm doing well. You?
I'm doing well. Well, other than rotator cuff surgery yesterday, but I'm doing well as I can.
Hopefully that'll feel better in the long run.
It sure will. So I just have a question. I'm not Jewish or anything, but lately I've been reading a lot of books about, the Holocaust and Krakow, the ghettos that the Jews were put in, and, just the persecution of the Jews during the Holocaust was horrific.
Yep.
I just watched Schindler's List last night. I'm just curious. I've read 3 books on the Holocaust. I watched Schindler's List, but nobody ever explains why was Hitler so obsessed with killing off the Jewish race. Nothing explains it in any of those books, and I always wonder, I'm like, why don't they talk about that? Why did he have such an evil spirit towards the Jews? What did they do to him?
Okay, so let me just repeat that for my listeners on Facebook who don't hear your question, and make sure that I paraphrase you correctly here. But your question, Mark, was why did Hitler hate the Jews? Why did he single out the Jews as a target?
Yeah.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. It wasn't the only group that he targeted. He also targeted the LGBTQ community. He targeted Jehovah's Witness. He targeted anybody that didn't fit his nice, convenient definition of Aryan, which, by the way, he himself did not fit.
Right.
There was a movement afoot at the time called eugenics, which theorized that if we could limit breeding and only breed quote-unquote perfect humans to perfect humans, we could evolve some super race. And that was kind of the underlying plan of this. And in those days, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. The other thing that's going on in the background is what was happening in Weimar, which was Germany after World War I. There were 2 things happening. One, society was much more fluid, the Weimar experiment, if you will, the attempt to make society more fluid in Europe. And as soon as that happened, Jews who had been forced to not own property and not do a lot of things started to move upward, because one of the things that Jewish culture supports, it's not a racial thing. There's no Jewish race, actually. You can join Jews, you can leave Jews. You can't do that with races. But race is a false construct anyway, and that doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. It absolutely does. I'll get back to that. But back to what's going on in Weimar is that Jews, because of the focus on learning, on numbers, and the things that the Jewish community did to survive, as soon as it was more open to them, they flourished. And Jewish businesses and business people became quite wealthy. And,
Yeah, I did see that in the books, and I did see that on
no, it's
Schindler's
not usually discussed much. But the other piece of taking Jews away is that it then leaves all of their jewelry, their pictures, their artwork, their stuff, their pots and pans, free to the looter who takes them. And
they stole a lot of stuff. I mean,
right, there's a ton
piles
of
and piles
right.
of
If you
jewelry.
disappear the occupant of the house, and you don't allow heirs to inherit, then there's a lot of stuff for people, and so they support that. And it's one of the ways that Hitler financed. You see a little bit of that in Schindler's List, but it's how the war was financed, was by the stolen goods, not just from Jews, but from the other communities that he targeted. He very specifically went after LGBTQ because he thought that was somehow defective. And
I didn't see that. They didn't talk about that
No.
in the 3 books I read. They never talked about that. They talked about mostly, Poland,
yeah.
Auschwitz, the other.
Well, again,
camp.
so let's talk about Poland or Auschwitz, or Auschwitz is in Poland. Let me back up. Let's talk about Poland and cleaning out the Jews. The Auschwitz comment was wrong. But and I could hear it as soon as my mouth said it. But the issue of going into a country and cleaning out the Jews, again, keeps the rest. Jews are a minority. They're only somewhere between 2 and 10% of the population. And so by targeting them, the rest of the population stays quiet because they're going to gain. As the Jews, again, are removed, they get the property. And nobody's coming after them.
They talked about a lot of Germans moving into the Jewish houses and just basically
taking everything. Yeah.
Bad.
So it was organized crime, if you will, right? Organized thievery, and with people not caring much about the lives of others. And one of the things that Hitler wrote in his diary, which is telling, was that he was surprised at how nasty the German people were, because he really wasn't German, he was Bavarian, how nasty the German people were to each other. They were willing to snitch on each other. They were willing to do really horrible things just so that their lives stayed a little calmer than it was for the folks they were picking on. And minorities historically can be picked on. I wish that the Holocaust was the only quote-unquote ethnic cleansing that went on or goes on the planet. There are right now active ethnic cleansings going on below the radar because our news doesn't report on it, unfortunately.
Really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I mean, the worst terrorists on the planet are Boko Haram. We don't hear about it because their victims are Muslim.
Yeah.
All right, so, you've got Chechnya, you've got Bosnia, you've got a whole raft of times where people have tried to exterminate some faction of the population. We see that with people trying to disenfranchise and segregate and alienate blacks or LGBTQ people here in the U.S. right now. And I wish that wasn't a human tendency. Unfortunately, it is. It's a bullying tactic. And really what Hitler was a uniformed bully allowed to get popular. Another of the reasons why that happened was because Germany was having to pay reparations from World War I. And those were impossible taxes. It was an impossible tributary system set up on Germany with the idea that, if we punish them bad enough, they won't be able to rise up. And one of the things that we've learned over time is that if you push people hard enough and bad enough, they do rebel.
Yes.
And, so it's the danger of sanctions. And we see that with economic sanctions throughout the world. Those are not things that people take lightly. And so Germany was in that position with a very unfair treatment. And so that gave a seed for Hitler to galvanize, if you will, the German people and keep them from participating in civil dissent. The other thing that you see a lot of, if you look at any of the newsreels and any of the stuff out of Germany, they really played up the uniforms. They really, really, I mean, the Hitler Youth, they put them in uniforms. Not unlike the Boy Scouts, but more so.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things that Stanley Milgram, a psychologist did a lot of work in the 50s, and he did some experiments. And one of the things that he did is he had somebody in a lab coat tell a subject to shock another person as an aid to helping them learn something. And the shocks were to increase all the way up to 330 volts, which it never did. The colleague who was pretending to be the learner was never shocked, but the person who was thinking they were administering the shocks didn't know that, because the quote unquote learner was in another room. He saw that person shackled into the chair to give the electric shock. He was invited to feel the shock, and then he was taken into the next room, and he was supposed to increase the voltage every time the student made a mistake. And at some point, the student starts screaming, "I've got a heart condition. This really hurts. I want out of here. I can't take this anymore." And then the student actually falls silent, and you don't know if he's alive or dead, and people are still increasing the voltage because the person in the lab coat tells them to do so.
Right.
And we are, by nature, compliant as a species. It helps survival. People have to comply to the leaders, but when the leaders get horrible, when the leaders become more concerned with themselves than the people they're supposed to be leading, then the system goes awry.
Right.
And when people...
Well, the three books I read, I don't know if Cliff will get mad if I, say what they were, but...
No, go ahead. Say what books they were.
The one was the Tattooist of Auschwitz.
The Tattoo of Auschwitz,
Yeah, Tattooist of Auschwitz, who was a Jewish man that was very artistic, so the Germans capitalized on that and made him tattoo all the numbers on the Jewish prisoners. And that was a very interesting book. And then I read We Were the Lucky Ones, about
We Were the Lucky
Jewish
Ones, okay.
Jewish families that
survived.
I guess you could say they were lucky because they survived.
Yeah. The walking wounded. Yeah.
It was terrible what they went through. And then I read, I read The Resistance, which was about
and the Resistance.
The Jews that were underground helping women and children escape, which was a very good book. And right now I'm reading another one about the Resistance. I don't remember the name. It's Resistance something or other.
Yeah.
That I'm reading now.
There's so another experimenter at the time in the 50s and 60s was Zimbardo, and he did the Stanford prison experiment, and that also shows how quickly people can get caught up in playing at cruelty. Humans will play a role if they think they can get away with it. Anonymity, and that's another thing that uniforms give. It gives perpetrators anonymity. We see that with the internet, that people can be much more nasty when they think their identities can't be determined.
Right.
And I say think because very often when the crime is big enough, then the technology is there to do a lot of backtracing, which people don't realize. And the other thing that I always tell people is to think that you're not on camera when you're walking outside anywhere today is an illusion. We find so many things. So that is, I think, a natural human tendency. There's another cool set of experiments that they did in a variety of places where they put somebody in uniform and ask people to do things, and people do it. But if the person's not in uniform, they won't do it. They'll ignore the person. And I'm not talking about a fancy uniform here. And sometimes they dress them up kind of look like a cop or a security guard. But one of the cases, all the person did was wear the high visibility traffic vest. And that was
Right.
enough that people started obeying. They did an experiment where it was a janitor in. They're silly little experiments, but they show that people what they will and won't do for others. So the one experiment is in a fast food restaurant where the researcher asks the people to move to another table for no reason, just could you please move over to this table. If the person is wearing a uniform, up to and including a janitor's uniform, the people will comply. But if the person's plain clothes, they won't.
Right.
And it's that uniform effect, that authority effect. And
they didn't explain this in the books either. There was in both two of the books it mentioned OD. What was the OD? It was some kind of representative of the German forces, I think, but it never actually said what they were.
I'm gonna
They had like Jaggernauts or something that were like Jewish police, and they basically, from what I understood in the books, turned on their own religious people and, persecuted the Jews most of them did. Persecuted the Jews along with the Germans to save their own hides.
To save their own hides. Yeah, I thank you, God, have never been in a position where I've had to choose. Although I confess I was actually thinking about that as I got out of the car. One of the things that the Germans used to do is they would tell mothers to pick which child to give them. The cruelty that went on is just, I don't know how I would react. I don't know what I would do. But at some point, right, Maslow says the most important human need is to survive. And if you believe that the only way you can survive is by harming others, most people will go that route.
Yeah.
Most people, that's what psychology is showing us, that's a survival instinct. It's only when you get to a place, you could look at that, the mother who had to pick the child, who then had to live with that. If she didn't pick a child, the Nazis would have killed everybody.
Yeah, that's what they.
Right. So that it's a saving of some.
You either give up these children, or your whole family gets wiped out. And unfortunately, even these I don't know if I'm saying it right, like juggernauts, whatever they were in the book. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly.
Okay.
I mean, in the end,
the capos, yeah,
they were killed too. They went to their grave knowing that they betrayed their own people, and they were still killed. The Germans were just, and I don't want to say Germans. I shouldn't say Germans. I mean,
Europeans would be closer, but yeah.
And there was a lot of sympathetic Germans that, of course, they wouldn't speak out, but they were not for the war.
Right, and so that brings up another point, which is when somebody's being a bully, the person who remains neutral is supporting the bully.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it was like in Schindler's List. And in Schindler's List, it said he was a German, but you're saying he's Bavarian?
Hitler, not Schindler.
No, Schindler. Okay, Hitler was.
Hitler
I know Hitler.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was neither German nor Aryan, so
Well, what was Schindler? Because Schindler, it said
Schindler was a German.
Okay.
Schindler was a German.
And like I said, he was one of the sympathetic ones. I mean, they show him watching the. I don't remember what the term they used when they those, but he was watching from a hill when they were.
He was Schindler was definitely a hero, Mark. He saved many, many people who wouldn't have otherwise been saved. And even he had to make choices, right? Even he had to make choices. They were horrible that way. A woman that I knew in Ohio was French, and this will give you an idea of what the Germans of the time, what kind of acts they were willing to do, and they rationalized it to themselves. It's just the way the system got way off of true north. It's about the only thing I can say about it. But what they did at this woman's school was they took everybody out of the classrooms and they lined them up in the yard, and they selected 3 students and shot them in the hips. And basically said, this is what we'll do to anybody who misbehaves. And think about that a minute. This woman was crippled for life because they shot her in her hip. And the only thing she was guilty of was being a living, breathing child.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
They used really horrific bully tactics.
Yeah, when I went to school, I mean, they touched a little bit of it. Of course, I've been out of school. I'm 61 now, but I never read any of these books until recently, and I was absolutely mortified that as a human being, others could be that terrible.
It was a horrible time, and it does show what people are capable of, and it's part of the reason why we need to defend the rights of the minority at all times, so that we don't repeat that kind of bullying, or I shouldn't say not repeat, because it still is going on, and we need to find a way as a species to have a consciousness change away from violence and bullying. And it's a horrible thing. God lets it happen because free will is part of the bargain. You can't love God without free will. And unfortunately, free will means that sometimes you can be really horrible. So
I got to say, the books I read, they did say in the acknowledgement that all these, the names were changed, but all these were actual events.
Yeah, they were horrible events. And like I said, if you look at world history right now, you're going to see many other really horrible. Now, one of the things that Germany had that not everybody does is they were able to get people to make machines and, ovens and things like that of mass destruction.
Right.
And they knew it was wrong because they hid it, and they've still done some of that because some of the camps have been, quote, reclaimed, and now you walk out and there's just this beautiful green field of nature, but horrible things happened on it. And I understand the desire to move away from that and not constantly hit the next generation for things that their parents did. And I've had the good luck of knowing a few wonderful German folk who are horrified by what happened, who work at trying to repair some of that damage.
Right.
And that's not to say that the bulk of the Germans are not they are kind. They're a wonderful people. It's just they got behind a fascist. And, they allowed somebody to basically create his own laws. Because that's what Hitler did. Everything he did was legal because he owned the machinery of the government.
Right.
Right. But he used legal, quote unquote, legal means and the support of a small percentage of the people. And it's something that we've seen remnants of here now and then in America. One of the scary things is the idea that some people are better than others. We're not. We're different.
Right.
Everybody is different. Everybody is God's gift. See, I start with a basic premise, Mark, which is that God doesn't make junk. And if God doesn't make junk, then nobody is junk. Everybody's got a gift to give. And that's where you get into things like, how do I help people be the best, whatever they are, without hurting others? That's, to me, the question. Especially this time of year. All right, when we're celebrating, Jewishly, we celebrate the dedication to God of the temple. Christians celebrate the forgiveness of Jesus. The Hindus celebrate the conquering of good over evil. All religions work on that same theme in some other way, that dedicating yourself to God. But clearly, God was not part of the equation. It was definitely a strange set of circumstances. But I wish it was a real anomaly. But unfortunately, it's not.
Right.
It is one that touches me personally. I lost cousins in the Holocaust who have my name. It's really chilling to see your name on the list of people killed by the Nazis.
So I'm sorry if I upset you.
No, you didn't upset me,
Mark.
Thank you for calling.
Thank you. To ask you that question, because none of these books ever explain what.
Yeah, well, it's because people still have trouble understanding it, but it's human nature in the hands of somebody who clearly was self-serving, and that was Hitler and his inner crew, because it couldn't have happened with just one.
Evil people.
Yeah, a collection of evil people who found a way to imbibe the most toxic, most addictive substance in the world, power.
Right.
And they were looking to grab power and wealth, and they did it. They did it at the expense of the Germans. Germany's economy took forever to recover from the damage of the war. They were on rations almost immediately. Hitler was not even good for Germany for as much as 3 months. So, yeah.
Well,
but fear runs rampant.
I want to apologize to the human race, because
well, we're all part of it, so it's we can't isolate anybody and say that it's them. It's all of us.
Yeah, I read these books, and I actually had tears coming down my face, and my wife was like, "What's the matter?"
Yep.
I was like, I just can't believe how evil and cruel these people were treated.
Yep.
It's not right. My God.
And it's not, and I'm gonna go to other places. It's not right the way that some prisoners in America are treated. It's not right. There's got to be a way to keep people safe without treating other human beings like animals.
Right.
And I think that we just need to really figure out how to do that as a species. That's, I think, the challenge. Yep. And how to not hurt others in our own effort to achieve happiness and success. So thank you very much for calling. I really do appreciate the call, Mark. It was a great chance to talk about some of the things of the Holocaust, of Shoah. Yeah, the Shoah means catastrophe. And I wish that it was isolated. I wish that it was. And I know that some people like to think of it that way. I get in trouble with some Jews because I'm more than willing to acknowledge all the other horrible things that humans do.
Right.
And it's just one of the things that Hitler had was a really good handle on technology. But, yeah.
All right, well, I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. Have a happy holiday, whatever holidays you celebrate, Mark. May they fill you with wonder. Thank you. And so if somebody else would like to call in, please do. Ask a Rabbi is 772-340-1590. I don't promise to have all the answers, but I will do my best. And the Holocaust Shoah is very, very difficult. And I know that the time around Kristallnacht for my mother was horrible because she lived through that in Vienna. She lived through Kristallnacht. Her family's bakery was destroyed.
In 71 A.D., Rome came into Israel and pretty much destroyed everything. But is there any rationality as to what they were there to destroy?
They were tired of rebellions. It's really the bottom line. Rome did a couple of things that didn't sit well with Judea and even Israel. And there's mismanagement, again, by Herod the Great. Herod the Great is actually the one who brings in the Romans to keep the peace because he can't keep the people peaceful. They're rebelling because he's taxing horrendously. He's doing conscripted labor to build his fortresses. And again, that's Jerusalem, Caesarea, Megiddo, Masada. There's a number of them all around the area. And to do that much building, and that's what made him, quote unquote, the great, is because he did so much building. And they bring other things in. The taxes are through the roof to pay for that, and people don't want to part with their money. Imagine that.
People have always been like that.
Yeah, and especially not for the king to build palaces. Yeah. Imagine that. And they don't like this king. They don't consider him really Jewish because his ancestors, and at the moment I'm forgetting if it's grandparents or exactly how many generations before him, were forcibly converted by the Hasmoneans, who shouldn't ought to have been king anyway because they were priests. And Judaism has always held that there should be a separation of church and state. So the priests take care of the temple and its ritual, and the king takes care of the army. That's the way it was supposed to work. But with the Hasmoneans, they're a priestly family taking over the government of the country. And so they get this wild idea, this wild hair, to go and forcibly convert everybody, and that includes the inhabitants of Idumea. From the historian Josephus, we get that Idumeans, converted in name only, they still practice what they used to practice. Gee, imagine that. Forcibly converting somebody to do something they don't believe in, and they stay with their older tradition. And so when he becomes king by marrying Mariamne, who's queen, who's the rightful queen, then the people rebel. They don't like him. They don't like what he's doing, and he is considered too much of a Rome favor courier. And he has 4 sons, all of whom are named Herod, which is why the name Herod continues so many generations in Christian scriptures. But Herod of the northern kingdom of Israel is able to, because Israel's a richer country than Judea, is able to pay the taxes, and he's not doing the building, and he's not having to support that big machine that Judea is having to support. So you've got economics playing a huge role here as well, and it's into that cauldron that we see the beginnings of the story of Jesus. It's a story of a rebellion against Rome, but that's unfortunately not allowed, because once Rome comes in, then there's literally hell to pay. There was a rebellion right around the time of Jesus. There's one shortly before him. There's one at 110. There's one at 67, which is when they come in. When they put that one down is when the temple and Jerusalem are wiped off the map, if you will. And that was done to stop that rebellion of 67. People had counted up and they said, oh, it's time for one, and they started one. And it starts during the festival of Sukkot, which is the festival of people walking around Jerusalem with palm leaves. Imagine that.
Familiar.
Yeah. Well, it's a nationalistic holiday. It's the time of the dedication of the temple. And it's actually an interesting piece, because the rabbis are struggling with Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is exactly that kind of celebration. And they're afraid that the Romans are going to kill the Jews because the Jews are wanting to be independent. We are a stiff-necked people. The idea of freedom and that sort of thing are very important.
You mentioned the separation of church and state originating with the Jewish people.
I don't know if it originated, but it's certainly one of the themes in Scripture.
Were any of our founding forefathers Jewish?
Certainly Jews played a big role in the freedom of America. Chaim Solomon, who actually financed most of a big chunk of what was going on, was Jewish, and he actually died penniless because the government would not repay the money it had borrowed from him.
Wow.
And that's a whole... You can read the story of Chaim Solomon, Haym Solomon, and he lived in the Philadelphia area. So yeah, there were a number of Jews here and there. Jews are a little harder to find in colonial America, not because they weren't Jewish, but because they were on the rolls of the church in some colonies. So, for example, in the town of Williamsburg, the Jewish doctor who runs the hospital is a member of the Anglican Church. He's not Christian. He's Jewish. And he gets a fine every week for not going to services because he doesn't believe in it. But in order to vote and have power in the colony, the British colony of Virginia, he needed to be part of the Church of England, which is what Anglicans are. And so he's on the rolls. So it becomes harder to tell who's who when that sort of thing is going on. They had a state religion in the colony of Virginia, and it was the Anglican, the Church of England. And, that stayed the church in some states as we became the United States. It's one of the reasons why Christianity did not become a state religion for the country, for the young country of 13 colonies, because each of the colonies had a different state church, if you will. Some had none, like New York, and the attempts to disenfranchise Jews in New York did not go over, in part because the business that owned that colony had Jews on the board. Imagine that. And they didn't want to exclude their Jewish merchant friends from being in the colony and having power. If we look, religion is just one of the things that people slice and dice other humans over. And there's a wonderful, there's a teacher in one of the seminaries in Ohio who did a wonderfully cute little story. She says, two people meet in the street and they say, are you Baptist? Yeah, I'm Baptist. Are you? Yeah, I am. I'm New Light Baptist. Oh, I'm also New Light. Are you Bright Cloud? And then she goes through a whole bunch of divisions, and they finally, after getting through 17 adjectives, find that they're somewhere different, and the one calls the other one heretic. She does this wonderful little routine on that.
So familiar.
And her end comment to that is, and that is the history of the church.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of questioning, like, are you post-trib,
Are you?
pre-trib?
Yeah. Are you? Well, yeah, yeah. When my father served in the military here in the U.S., somebody came up to him. He was a chaplain, and one of the soldiers asked him, "Was he a Southern Baptist rabbi or a Northern Baptist rabbi?" And not having any ready answers to that question, and my father said, "What do you think?" He was always very good at flipping the question.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and then the guy said, "Well, you're so nice, you must be Southern Baptist." And my father just kind of said, "Good day," and walked on. 'Cause there was nowhere to go in that conversation. And but there is always division, and there was division when the 13 colonies came together. They could not agree on any flavor of Christianity or anything else. There were Muslims; they were called Mohammedans. Jefferson writes about them in his writings, the Mohammedans who do this and that. And there were other religions. There were Hindus. There are Confucianists. There's many different religions, often below the radar, not huge and populous, but certainly represented. And to think that America is anything other than that beautiful mosaic of black, white, green, purple is to miss the wealth and the beauty of our country. Our country was founded on the contributions of many different people from many different cultures, some of which was not voluntary. And yes, there's ugly parts in there. And I think that we need to own, just as I'm saying the Hasmoneans were horrible in their forced conversion, good people do horrible things in certain circumstances. It doesn't make them right. But we need to own that and recognize what it does, because when somebody damages other human beings, they're damaging themselves. You can't sideswipe the mud you're slinging and not get some of it on yourself. You just can't. There is no such thing as strata of human beings. We are all human beings. To quote Shakespeare, if you cut me, do I not bleed? We all are human. And having had a blood test today, I can tell you about bleeding. I've got this wonderful thank you from that event. And we're human. We do want to slice and dice. We want to figure out who's in and who's out. We want to know who are our people and who's everybody else. That worked really, really well when we were nomads, hunter-gatherers, and resources were really scarce. And not to say there is a need for the Christmas kids. There's a need for Sarah's Kitchen, for the food banks. We have the highest population of food insecure and clothing and housing insecure people in this area that I think we've ever had. And we need to address that as a people. We need to bring the folks that are economically challenged for one reason or another up to a reasonable level and help them be contributing. Because if they're worried about where the next meal comes from, they cannot contribute at their highest level. They just can't. They have to be focused on where's that next meal going to come from? Where am I going to sleep tonight? It's going to be 50 degrees out there. What am I going to do? And I understand Ohio and Minnesota and all the places that get white stuff out of the sky, that it gets a lot colder there. But for Floridians, that's pretty dang cold. In Tucson, we used to have something called Operation Deep Freeze, where we went and actually collected those who wanted to come into the churches and the synagogues and the mosques, get a hot meal for dinner, be able to use the showers and the spaces, and they had sleeping bags to sleep on. They had a warm night inside in a heated building, and then in the morning they had hot breakfast and they were given a bag lunch and allowed to continue on out. And we alternated. We took different nights through the winter when the weather was likely to be cold in Tucson. Operation Deep Freeze. I wish we did something like that here. I'd love to. It
certainly gets cold enough. It gets below 70, we start calling FEMA.
Well, yes, I think that what is cold is a function of your climate. And so there are nights where I'd like to not think of children and people who are ill having to sleep outside in the cold because they don't have anywhere else to sleep, to go. We definitely need to work at that. We need to create some reasonable micro housing of some sort so that people can have some semblance of autonomy, of dignity, and safety. Shelter, low cost, reasonable. It doesn't have to be more than a hotel room size kind of thing. Something where people can come in. The idea that there aren't shelters here in Port St. Lucie and in Fort Pierce and all around is sad beyond words. We have people who are food insecure. We have people who are having to deal with the very, very basics. Where am I going to sleep tonight? What am I going to eat? How can I put clothes on my back? Do I buy my child a pair of pants and a shirt, or do I buy them undies? Parents shouldn't have to make those decisions. And yes, some parents don't do a great job of knowing what to buy when. And they'll spend money on the wrong things. But that's a skill piece. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to say we can do a better job in our schools of teaching people life skills. That really needs to start at 6th to 8th grade. How do I fill out an application for a job? How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I work the computer to find what I need?
And how to bank and budget.
How to bank, how to budget. All of those.
Yeah.
Right? How to balance your checkbook. Especially now when we've got so many wonderful tools online, how do we help them do that? How do we get at least an iPad or a smartphone into everybody's hands so that they can be technologically functional? How do we gently bring the older population to a place where they're comfortable with the technology as well? There's so many avenues for improving the condition of fellow human beings here in Port St. Lucie. We need to do that. It's just something we need to do as a species. And there are a lot of haves in this area, but there are also a lot of have-nots. And they are still human beings and still worthy of dignity. Not being looked down on as somehow I'm better than you because I have $200 to rub together in my account and you don't. Or 2,000 or 2 million. I don't care what that number is. There is a righteous need. Right? Judaism doesn't, we have something called tzedakah, so do the Muslim tzedakah. And that's righteous giving. It's not charity. It's not a choice. It's not a gift. It's a requirement. It's a Jewish requirement that we support those who are less fortunate. And it is fortune. It's just luck. And they didn't have the luck of getting the skills. They didn't have the luck of everything else. Christmas kids, a good start. We need to do a lot more, actually. I hate to say that when the station has participated in a wonderful event that helps kids, does a lot of good.
Well,
And
there are other organizations around here that do really good as well.
Yeah.
Care Bag does great for the homeless folks with personal hygiene
absolutely.
products.
Absolutely. So many different things. But we need to do more. We still need to do more. And we need to get it organized so that 15 people aren't trying to be the best whatever, right? So that we can get synergy out of that energy. Yeah. And that's another side challenge. And that has to do with that substance called power. Even in charities, there's power. Even in charities, there are people who are money grubbers. So I wish we were different as a species. I think we can be. That's the eternal optimist in me. I've got 2 minutes, so it's as good a time as any to say Chanukah starts Sunday night, and it runs for 8 crazy nights, as Sandler likes to say in his song. And we wish everyone a great Chanukah. We have our third Friday dinner tonight, and we'll be preparing chicken and brisket and salmon. And yes, we do share that with others. We share it with first responders. And then we've got the Night of 10,000 Lights the following Friday. You're welcome to join us. Bring a Chanukah if you don't have a Chanukah menorah. If you don't have one, we have a few spares. We'll be lighting up the space with all the beautiful Chanukah lights. Turn out the lights and look at it. It is so gorgeous. So that's our Night of 10,000 Lights. Please do join us. Whatever holiday you celebrate in this season of 22 different holidays, I hope that it is joyous for you. This is Rabbi Shafir Loeb for Congregation Eitz Chaim. You can find us at www.eitzchaim.org, eitzchaim.org, or on Facebook. We stream our services. We still do that. We did it before COVID, and we're doing it even now. So wishing everybody a great holiday and a great Shabbat. God willing, I'll be here next Friday at 10:05 for another episode of Ask a Rabbi. If you'd like to sponsor one, please give a call to the station, 772-340-1590. Rabbi Shafir Loeb.
Archives of this show can be found on YouTube. Simply go to WPSLTV.com and look for Ask a Rabbi on WPSLTV.com. This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.